Well, hello everyone. It's a great pleasure to be joining this ACMC 21 conference from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Appreciating the possibility to participate in this meeting alongside colleagues with such transcendent experiences and with a vocation to share them fraternally within the framework of this professional network, I will try to draw attention to the need of building cultural impact assessment modalities different than those based on the economic dimension of culture. This will require defining some ontological, historical, and doctrinal particularities of the South American experience, plus identifying a tendency to the breaking down of the logical framework in cultural policies in our region. Finally, I will elaborate some specific proposals on how to advance in the construction of a cultural impact assessment model derived from the described perspective. For this purpose, we will understand cultural management as a profession devoted to the design, implementation, and evaluation of cultural policies. And these, which also constitute a polysemic term, as those policies that have in the symbolic dimension of life in society their primary focus. Thus, we seek to distinguish them from public policies in general, which, as has been increasingly observed, have a high cultural dimensionality in themselves, insofar as they are culturally determined. To this end, I will express the need to focus on the deontological dimension of our profession, attending to the crafting of an applied ethic that emanates from a philosophy that seeks to break with Eurocentrism and the colonial legacy so as to contribute to the intercultural tradition in a systemic way. This presentation will try to introduce the debate among a number of thinkers and intellectuals in our region on a series of global challenges. Considering the fact that they have not written and have not been translated mostly into English, I intend to question the way in which language issues deepen unequal power relations, an issue that has been increasingly observed within our professional field. Consequently, I will describe this reflection within the framework of our collective search to apply intercultural philosophy to cultural cooperation, which is being carried out within the framework of brokering intercultural exchange network, in which colleagues with similar motivations concur. I would like to thank them for their contribution to this paper and for the possibility of avoiding the risk of essentialism binarisms that constitute a particular challenge for the construction of intercultural policies by finding strategic partners within the global north. At this point, we welcome the fact that NCAT is opening up beyond Europe, moving from its traditional stance to incorporate new voices, from the first time including instances in a language other than English. First of all, I must stress that I'm reflecting on these issues from Argentina, the southernmost country in America, in particular from Buenos Aires, a city that has forged its identity by seeking to become the Europe in America, and failed indeed. To speak from America is to speak from a land that has been snatched over the last 5 centuries. Even its imposed name, America, has been assumed by an imperial power which speaks and thinks in from a different basis, an Anglo-Saxon basis. To speak from America, Nuestra América, is to speak from an extensive and diverse territory in which the Iberian languages generated a powerful cultural unity, and in which an impressive cultural diversity and biodiversity still survives. To speak from our America implies recognizing that this cultural difference expresses the presence of different humanity projects, other than those which hegemony was generated in the framework of the colonial adventure. From this place, then, I want to present some reflections with no greater intention than to make known some of the concerns that we are experiencing and which deserve to be considered from their own identity. We would like then to share some reflections that tend to deepen this alternative, from the deontological approach of cultural management, whose social function has been increasingly questioned. The intention is to break with the ideological influence that restricts its cultural management to the artistic, and moreover to particular patrimonies from the elites. We propose it with the understanding that decolonization implies not only changing the contents of the conversation, but also the terms. We must ask ourselves who is talking, on whose behalf, from where, and what are the stakes attached.
Cejudo Córdoba is right when he points out that cultural management requires an applied ethic. This is, according to this author, one that needs to be recognized in one's own field of action. In other words, it is conditioned by the environment and the context, by culture. Our reality and daily challenges, our identities and cultures, are strongly determined both by our particular historical and political experience, as well as by that territory in which our particularity grows. The need to guarantee the sustainability of those particularities of these experiences, or cultural diversity, is increasingly accepted in political terms in both social and academic records. Based on this, a number of Latin American intellectuals have been thinking about how to build post-Westernism through what has become the decolonial current over the years. This raises the urgency of interrupting the colonial legacy in its multiple dimensions, among which politics, ontology, and epistemology constitute the main issues. This quest for the rupture of coloniality, as well as the construction of an alternative overcoming order, constitutes a growing debate in relation to our professional field of action. The idea of a post-colonial cultural management is beginning to gain adherence both in the Global South and by valuable colleagues in the heart of what has been called the West. To move forward in this political sense, we must also restore a sense of praxis, since an action is superior to an idea, but at the same time, all action entails an ethic. To recover the ethical dimension in those debates on artistic production, questioning the reduction of its phenomenology to the aesthetic dimension is an imperative of this age, marked by a crisis as acute as the one our humanist project is going through. The time of taking advantage of the planet and its fertility without protecting it is over, and the time of human disposal is over as well. We know this, but we are not reaching the political imagination to build an alternative towards a better system. We believe that without sacredness, this cannot be done, and that in the replacement of an horizon of transcendental meaning in which communities can be collectively fulfilled, culture and its management have a transcendental raison d'être. We need to ask ourselves recurrently how much of our daily professional effort really contributes to the construction of a new common sense, which ultimately is what we talk about when we talk about culture, because possibly everything that is not building it is hindering its emergence. Our locus of enunciation is a territory that has been invented as a third world, as a counterweight to the universalization of the European particularity, known as modernity, which was understood not merely as a moral good, but as a historical necessity. The dictum of being the one culture, the canon, was what drove the Western elites to the conquest of the world. Their ideal, what they thought, was the annexation of the orb to the imperial domination, structured around the categories of North European thought. As the thinkers of the so-called decolonial turn have identified, colonialism was the obverse of modernity, so one cannot be questioned without challenging the other. In their classic work examining numerous definitions of the term culture, Kroeber and Kluckhohn identified that in the Western tradition, the term has often been homologated with civilization. There is no possibility of addressing cultural diversity as long as the civilizational taxonomy that classifies cultures according to a particular civilizational criterion persists. The main myth to be demolished is that which sustains, through multiple influences over common sense, the idea of Western superiority. This vision, crucial to the worldwide installation of the imperial project, focused the notion of an European exceptionality, set up as a canon for the analysis of the rest of the collective human experiences. These were restricted from being considered civilizations, as this was reserved exclusively for the European process, and began to be judged according to their proximity to it. The customs of the peoples were considered barbaric from the point of view of racism as an ideological framework. All the policies for administration of the otherness that we have seen in contemporary history are determined by racism, understood as a social taxonomy by the fallacious idea of race. Both the essential racism, which evolved lately in scientific racism, which postulates the elimination of the non-Western other, and assimilationism, which is presented as a progressive overcoming under the proposition of elevating the culture of those barbaric groups, that is, accompanying them to abandon their cultural specificity to embrace the European ways, ultimately propose the same thing, the elimination of the other as such. It is only with the development of multiculturalism since the middle of the last century that the possibility that otherness must be tolerated begins to be cautiously validated by the intellectual hegemonic field. Only 70 years ago. The limitation of the multicultural perspective, which assumes diversity as a challenge, obeyed to the search for coexistence as the maximum degree of socio-cultural interaction, and ends up frequently functioning as a containment wall for full respect and cultural exchange on part of the states. The mondialization of European thought, as local as the rest, is failed as universality is an unrealizable fiction. From a philosophical standpoint, South American thinkers have argued that cultural configurations are determined both by the socio-historical conditions of the community that produced them and by the land on which they occur. This is the only universal condition, the situated universal. It could be wrongly thought that it disables the function of cultural management. If culture is historically given and determined by the territory where it is rooted, why should it be managed? The answer has to do particularly with the challenges generated by the eruption of the colonial trauma. When this becomes flesh in a framework of coloniality, communities are shifted away from their own center, disturbing the balance of self-esteem. Looking at the world through other people's lenses distorts social capabilities. When the image that returns from the mirror of culture, in which a community looks at itself, is not its own but of the others, the cultural problem acquires a political and social dimension. Keller warned in his classic text on social responsibility of the cultural manager that detaching a person from their cultural identity increases vulnerability. Cultural management acquires meaning insofar as it acts as a discipline seeking to empower the community to undo this curse, by placing its own culture and history back at the center of its vital device. This does not imply the compartmentalization, insularization, or essentialization of it, since dialogue with other collectivized human experiences must take place from a position of self-evaluation and respect for otherness that allows for sensitive exchange. In fact, it is impossible to prevent meeting and exchange within cultures and identities. These are inherent to the human experience as intercultural philosophy warns, desirable. The deepest reason for being of any culture is to be able to offer its members a symbolic horizon that makes the realization of an existential project possible. The link within the everyday and this sacred horizon is the purpose behind the cultural activisms. In order to restore this imbrication between daily life and the sacred dimension, the ritual appears, underlying as the mechanism and the mechanics behind what we today call activities. In America, for example, time is not understood as an ascending linearity like that of Hegelian tradition of history. Time is above all cyclical. Rituality has the function of making us return to an essential time, where the future lies within the past, and accumulation is meaningless. Modernity installs a compulsion for the new. Having mentioned the need for social change, which is, in our perspective, constitutive of this profession, we must problematize this rampage for novelty, which sets up as the basis of capitalist acceleration. Assigning an intrinsic value to the new, by its very condition, can constitute an strategic error. The distinction, which is ultimately what defines the new as such, is a component of Western globalized epistemology that leads us to focus on individual trajectories rather than on the social function of our profession. The question for cultural management seems to be, with greater recurrences, what deserves to be preserved rather than what we need to reinvent. For example, let's think about the research debates in cultural management. In the search for topics to investigate, novelty becomes a fetish, in the absence, as we said, of a reflection on transcendence. I recently attended a PhD session in which some candidates presented their research projects to a well-respected and beloved colleague. I was shocked as all the observation and advice focused on whether or not the issue has been analyzed previously and how it could become interesting for funding, being novel, of course. At no time was the social or cultural functionality of the research discussed or considered at all. What is the purpose of this research? It seems to be exclusively for the constitution of the professional I, in that crazy race to be someone. With this bias, our profession divorces itself day by day from the reality in which it operates. Behind this lies a policy in which meaning, politics, become subordinate to technique. I appeal for not allowing technical expertise to dominate our professional vocation. Technique must exist and must be perfect, as an instrument to fulfill our quest in the best possible way. Technique as an end in itself is the result of the same philosophical system of exacerbating the individual above all, above community, above humankind, above nature, that we have already denounced. Now, why do we speak about communities? Another political challenge for cultural management is the disruption of the individual as the basic philosophical foundation, which is also characteristic of the modernity that has taken over everything. The individual does not produce culture, but a community does, agreeing on a set of symbolic horizons. I am aware that talking about people in these circles can be problematic because of the experience of nationalisms in Western history, but I believe that here too there is a debate that must be launched with a gesture of solidarity from the West to move away from its particular experience, opening up to others. In fact, the academic discussion on the category of populism, which is understood in a divergent way in different socio-historical contexts, is a sign that the decentered epistemological interpretation can be of great benefit. According to our South American experience, the people are understood as an ethical mythical nucleus, from which culture is made flesh. The collective experience of the us situated above the earth alone comes before being in individual terms, as modern Western ontology has imposed, cogito ergo sum, and with no intention of becoming so. This ethical historical core gets constantly reviewed and updated, and culture is the main ground from which it does so, since the symbol takes precedence over the concept. All men symbolize, not all conceptualize. To insist on this viewpoint, art history as we understand it is in crisis. In principle, it can no longer be solely focused on the artist and the piece, as the inclusion of a third dimension becomes essential. This third dimension is the collective reception, hermeneutics, and resignification that a community makes of this production based on the symbolic structure of each culture. In this context, the problem of the logical framework for cultural management emerges. How does the dialectical relationship between strategic objectives, action, and evaluation in cultural policies that assume social transformation as the main goal works? Clive Gray has shown the impact of the basic disciplines that lend cultural policy its epistemological and terminological framework. He suggests that the process-oriented focus of cultural management will be structured differently by an anthropology or economically based approach, as the case may be. Given the growing impact of cultural diversity on cultural policies, at least for the last 3 decades, with resonant implications at the regional South American level, we propose the inclusion of new ways of measuring the outcomes of cultural policies. Cultural diversity has forced cultural policies to rethink themselves from the perspective of its respect and promotion. We have identified that a new generation of cultural policies seems to be born from this premise, and we have outlined the main conceptual challenges in order for their implementation. In South America in particular, this perspective has begun to be included within the public sector, although in a shallow and partial manner, and generally with less funding than the minimum necessary. But getting citizens to consider them is a difficult task, given the lack of any meaningful indicators to show that they are worthwhile. Beyond this, we need to highlight the relevance of cultural impact assessment in an intercultural perspective, having identified that cultural policies oriented towards social transformation have major limitations for being measured with tools inherent to the economics of culture. The underdevelopment of the sociological and anthropological approach in the instance of cultural evaluation is in part due to the fact that only those evaluation methodologies based on the economistic conception of culture have managed to show efficiency and build an aura of legitimacy within the profession.
For example, in those diversity-oriented cultural policies that we've been analyzing within the region, complex objectives recurrently appear, linked to the search for the promotion of the legacies and heritage of racialized groups, mainly but not exclusively indigenous people, Afro-Americans, and regional migrants. We should point out that categorizing them as minorities constitutes another vice of the coloniality of knowledge. While in the global north, racially oppressed populations might constitute minor portions of each national population, in South America they often constitute social majorities.
One of the main methodological pitfalls is that actions do not necessarily correspond dialectically with the objectives in a clear way. For example, it is not clear how raising awareness about the daily exercise of racism is solved through a music festival or a photographic exhibition. The first analysis constructed to explore this outcome indicate that those who attend such events tend to already have an established position in relation to the value sought to be strengthened. Additionally, few express to have experienced a radical transformation of their views as a result of this experience. As a concrete example, we will bring one from the Argentinian case. Strengthening the processes of Afro-Argentinian affiliation. This is promoting that Argentines who are part of the African diaspora acknowledge this condition, opening the possibility of appreciating it. Despite the value of the fact that the National Ministry of Culture has created a program to work on Afro-Argentinism, which is particularly disruptive in a context of a country that has denied the existence of black population in its midst, there are no indicators that can account for the transformation that it has or has not achieved almost 10 years after its creation. The sole evidence of its work is a report of activities carried out. Interculturality has been widely discussed, but scarcely practiced, and affirmative action, characteristic of the multicultural perspective, ends up being the only concrete tool that has managed to become widespread. So, how do we operationalize an intercultural perspective in cultural management? How do we ensure that our practices disrupt the universe in order to bet on transforming it into a pluriverse, a world in which many worlds fit? We can first of all have a modest certainty. We should interrupt the reproduction of what we have been doing in the field. This well-known cultural management practice has resulted in sustaining the status quo through the ceiling of the common senses based on the superiority of civilization, Western civilization. Secondly, and now entering the terrain of debate, and what I'm interested in bringing to this shared working table, understanding that positive discrimination, quotas for subjects from traditionally oppressed groups, is not enough to undo the mechanisms of symbolic oppression, and that, on the contrary, they might well accompany its maintenance. If in order to have space to enunciate within our Western constituted devices, the racialized subjects are required to abandon their extra-canonical particularities, becoming westernized, anthropomorphizing themselves and their practices, assuming white, urban, progressive models of enunciation, we are deepening symbolic violence. It seems that, in order to cover the other's quota, we require them to make the effort to stop being other. The other has to be taken in precisely for their condition. Choosing those westernized, civilized subjects to represent a collective that they are progressively, and possibly unconsciously, abandoning by whitening their symbolic arsenal represents the extremism of symbolic violence. In this sense, the educational dimension is more transcendent than the normative for building interculturality. We require a post-normal refoundation of cultural management. Fantowicz and Rabbets imagined a new epistemological contract in situations that require to transcend systemic uncertainties when traditional methodologies are ineffective and quality assurance of scientific inputs to the policy process requires an extended peer community, consisting of all those relevant subjects involved in the discussion of the issue. They seek to transcend the classical scientific modalities applied to defined problems, seeking tools for times when disciplines require exponential maturation. Interrupting the reproduction of modernity as a sole canon is not enough to build in power alternatives. The articulation of new logics is made more difficult by the fact that much of the contemporary theoretical and political imaginary is articulated by a hyper-real modernity. In this sense, when it comes to evaluation, it only seems to be understood from a rational, numerical, and economically oriented perspective, leaving other ways of grasping the world outside. Different evaluation experiences subordinate culture to development. In our concerns, culture is not to promote development as itself, but called to produce a new imagination that could lead to the construction of a better notion of development than the current ontological framework. This understanding of development has led us to a dead end. The UN itself admits that by 2050, when my son, who was born in 2011, will be my age, half of the world's population will not have access to water. We have to think, as the Latin American world model tried to do in the 70s, of a humanitarian model with well-being at the gravitational center of concerns. We believe that cultural management is an appropriate tool to stimulate it. For the first time in history of the species, the challenge is no longer how do we generate more so that it's enough, but how do we ensure that what we manage to produce is distributed on a more sensible way. The intellectuals involved in this process were predicting catastrophe or new society as early as 1977. We can sadly say that the 4 decades since this warning has been lost. We just pushed the accelerator. Measuring culture from its economic dimension, even if we seek sustainable development, we will not succeed in installing the necessary concept of fulfillment or realization. With the guarantee of basic needs, realization is still pending. We humans do not come into the world just to produce goods or to get rich. We come to fulfill a mission which gives transcendental meaning to our lives. That requires symbolism. The content, the orientation of that mission is culturally and historically mediated by cultural identity, community, family and personal history, and the psychosocial conditions of the subject. This is what is essentially beautiful about our work. We must limit ourselves to generating the subjective conditions so that everyone can identify the way in which they want to complete this challenge. For this, we must be clear that no one is fulfilled in a community that does not realize itself, which is why, once again, the subject of culture is inevitably collective. We certainly need tools to measure the progress of cultural policies in this sense. Socially validated measuring devices are urgent in order to build new political sensibilities that can appreciate cultural action beyond the numerically measurable impact. Some argue that measuring socio-cultural impact has a certain analogy with apicultural production. One can weigh the liters of honey produced, count the honeycombs and even the bees, but it's very difficult to know the impact of the bees' pollination on the ecosystem. Given that no single analysis allows for an exact evaluation of the reality and impact on cultural policies in a territory, Bonnet recommends preserving a plurality of inputs for the construction of cultural indicators, implementing mixed systems of source verification with horizontal methods in the construction of data and indicators. The development of the Intercultural Coexistence Index in 2016 by a team coordinated by Paulina Soto Labe stands out as a remarkable experience. This index invites us not to stagnate in the economistic rhetoric postulated by the narrative of the creative industries and to engage in evaluation of the sensitive. It identifies that the humanitarian crisis has a cultural component, so that culture itself, if transformed, can offer counter-hegemonic political alternatives to overcome it. This is why the ICI advocates for a redistribution of the sensible, which is what it ultimately seeks to measure. To this end, the need to shift from instrumental measurement, based on a paradigm with objective pretensions, to one of social evaluation is identified. In this era that Wayne Modest called the age of decolonization, this discussion, which might be perceived as tedious and postponable because of its operational complexity, gets urgent. This first year of the global pandemic has shown us that institutions can be shut down, projects interrupted, or even never started at all. The trauma is not minor, and we can only sympathize conceptually and concretely with those workers in the sector in all its forms and scenarios. What we should not, although we can, is go back to business as usual, without engaging in the gesture of political imagination to recreate the whole thing in a different way. The objective of reducing inequalities was a good start, but limiting ourselves to it may prove insufficient at this point. We have the urge to build a world that not only guarantees the basic objective conditions for the reproduction of life, but also takes up the challenge of opening up horizons of possibility for each individual to fulfill themselves within the framework of a society that fulfills itself in a sustainable and equitable way. Thank you very much.